In this video, we will look at all prisoners executed in the United States in the month of July. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Welcome to Criminal Files. Dennis Michael Sochor. On the evening of January 1, 1982, in the humid suburban stretches of Broward County, Florida, a family sat around a dinner table watching the clock tick past the hours. 18-year-old Patricia Gifford had not come home. Her bed was made. Her phone calls went straight to silence. By nightfall, panic turned into an urgent call to the police. When investigators began tracing the final missing hours of Patricia's life, every single lead converged on one man, a 30-year-old military veteran named Dennis Michael Sochor. What could have driven him to commit a crime so dark that it would shatter a family for nearly half a century? To understand what transformed Dennis Sochor into a monster, you have to understand who he really was before that catastrophic night. We need to go back, far beyond the night of the crime, back to the very beginning. Dennis Michael Sochor was born into a working-class family in mid-century America. To anyone looking in from the outside, his upbringing appeared unremarkable. But beneath the calm surface, disturbing cracks were already beginning to show. Growing up, Sochor possessed a volatile temper, a sudden, unpredictable switch that could turn minor disagreements into terrifying, violent outbursts. As a young man during the Vietnam era, Sochor enlisted in the United States military. The armed forces gave him structure, uniform, and training, but they could not cure the dark impulses taking root inside him. Colleagues and acquaintances began noticing a troubling pattern. When Sochor drank, his personality transformed completely. Alcohol unleashed a dark, aggressive alter ego, particularly toward women. After leaving the military, Sochor bounced from city to city, taking odd jobs and living in temporary housing. He was a man drifting through life, incapable of building lasting relationships, driven by a simmering hostility whenever he felt rejected or disrespected. Long before he ever crossed paths with Patricia Gifford, Dennis Sochor was already a walking powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark was lit on December 31, 1981, New Year's Eve. 18-year-old Patricia Gifford was vibrant, full of energy, and remembered by her family as a girl whose bright smile lit up every room she entered. She had her whole life ahead of her. That night, Patricia and her close female friend went out to a popular lounge in Fort Lauderdale to ring in the new year. At the same lounge, Dennis Sochor was sitting at the bar alongside his brother, Gary. Over the loud music and holiday cheers, Sochor struck up a conversation with Patricia and her friend. For hours, they talked, laughed, and celebrated. Dennis presented himself as a friendly, charismatic military vet, a calm guy extending a warm holiday gesture. Patricia had no reason to doubt him. Around midnight, Patricia's friend suddenly became violently ill. Seeing her distress, Dennis and his brother offered to walk the sick friend out to her car so she could rest in safety. Patricia was touched by the gesture. With her friend sleeping in the back seat of the vehicle, Patricia agreed to hop into Dennis's truck with the two brothers to grab a quick late-night bite at a local diner before heading home. It was a decision born out of simple, innocent trust. But the moment the truck doors slammed shut and the headlights cut into the dark Florida night, the atmosphere inside the cab turned icy cold. Instead of driving toward a diner, Dennis Sochor steered his truck away from the main road, deep into an isolated pitch-black area of Broward County. He pulled off the road and cut the engine. In the absolute quiet of the night, Sochor turned to Patricia and attempted to force himself on her. Terrified, Patricia refused. She fought back with everything she had, pushing him away and rejecting his demands. Rejection was the one thing Dennis Sochor's fractured ego could not tolerate. In an instant, the friendly facade crumbled, replaced by what his brother later described as a berserk rage. Sochor slammed Patricia down inside the truck cab. As the 18-year-old girl screamed desperately for help, his brother Gary panicked and tried to pull Dennis off her. But Dennis shoved his brother back and clamped his hands around Patricia's throat. He squeezed until her screams turned to gasps, until her gasps faded into silence, and her body went completely limp. Realizing what he had done, Dennis Sochor did not call for help. He did not show remorse. He drove deep into the remote, desolate stretches near the Florida Everglades, hauled Patricia's body out of the truck, and discarded her remains in the dark. To this day, despite decades of relentless searches, police digs, and family pleas, Patricia Gifford's body has never been found. And just when Dennis thought he had swallowed his crime into the night, a single broadcast would change everything. The next morning, January 1st, 1982, Patricia's friend woke up in her car. Realizing Patricia was nowhere to be found, she immediately contacted the police. Detectives rushed to the Fort Lauderdale lounge, combing through every detail. Then they got their first major break. A camera inside the bar had captured a photo from the New Year's Eve party. Sitting right next to Patricia was a man whose face was partially visible. Detectives immediately handed the photo over to local news stations. That evening, across Broward County, televisions lit up with the image of the unidentified suspect. Dennis Sochor was sitting in his own living room when his face suddenly appeared on the screen. Panicking, realizing that the net was closing in, Sochor packed a small bag, abandoned his home, left his roommates behind, and ran. For 5 long years, Dennis Sochor lived as a ghost. He changed his name, worked cash-in-hand odd jobs, drifted between state lines, and kept his head down, always looking over his shoulder. But detectives refused to let Patricia's case go cold. They tracked down Gary Sochor, who broke under questioning and admitted the truth. His brother had murdered Patricia Gifford. The 5-year manhunt finally ended in 1986 in Georgia, when police pulled Sochor over on an unrelated charge. A run of his fingerprints flagged a federal warrant for murder, and Dennis Sochor was extradited back to Florida in handcuffs. In the interrogation room, faced with his brother's testimony and overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Sochor finally broke. On tape, he confessed 3 separate times. He admitted to strangling Patricia after she rejected his advances and described how he hid her body. In 1989, a jury convicted Dennis Sochor of kidnapping and first-degree murder. By a 10-2 vote, they recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed, declaring the murder cold, calculated, and atrocious. Sochor was sent to death row at Union Correctional Institution, where he would sit for 37 long years, fighting every appeal, while Patricia's family suffered through decades of agonizing waiting. Finally, on July 14, 2026, the long road of justice reached its end. At 74 years old, Dennis Michael Sochor was prepared for execution at Florida State Prison. For his last meal, Sochor was served a standard requested meal under Department of Corrections protocol. At 6 p.m., the heavy brown curtain to the execution chamber swung open. Behind the glass, Sochor lay strapped to a metal gurney, IV lines running into his arms. When asked by the warden if he had any final words, Sochor looked toward the glass. He offered his last statement, apologizing directly to the family of Patricia Gifford, saying he was deeply sorry, thanking his own family for their support, and commending his spirit to Jesus Christ. He said, "I want to apologize directly to the family of Patricia Gifford. I am deeply, deeply sorry for the pain and suffering I brought into your lives all those years ago. To my family, thank you for loving me and standing by me through all of this. I ask for forgiveness and I commend my spirit into the hands of Jesus Christ." At 6:03 p.m., the chemical lethal injection began flowing through the IV tubes. Sochor breathed heavily for about a minute, sputtered briefly, and then became entirely still. The warden stepped forward, called his name, and checked his eyes. There was no response. At 6:16 p.m., a medical examiner pronounced Dennis Michael Sochor dead. At 74, he became one of the oldest inmates executed in Florida's modern history, bringing a quiet, heavy finality to a 45-year crime that left a family searching for a daughter whose body remains lost to the shadows. James Aren Duckett. On the muggy evening of May 12, 1987, in the quiet, rural town of Mascot, Florida, 11-year-old Teresa McCabe sat at her kitchen table trying to complete her homework. Realizing she was missing a simple pencil, she asked her mother, Sylvia, if she could walk down to the neighborhood Circle K store to buy one. Her mother hesitated. It was dusk, and the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on. But Mascot was a tiny, tight-knit town where everyone knew everyone. Sylvia handed her daughter a few coins, watched her step out the front door, and reminded her to come straight back. Teresa walked down the road, bought her pencil, and stepped back out into the warm Florida air. Hours passed. Night fell completely over the town, and Teresa never made it back to her doorstep. By midnight, anxious family members and neighbors were searching the streets with flashlights. The intense search reached a solemn conclusion. Early the next morning, when a passing resident noticed a bright floral pattern submerged in the water of Lake Knight. Near the reedy shoreline, searchers made the heartbreaking discovery of young Teresa McCabe. When state investigators painstakingly pieced together the timeline, physical evidence, and eyewitness accounts from that night, the investigation did not lead to a wandering stranger. Instead, the evidence pointed directly to a local figure who wore a uniform, carried a badge, and took an oath to protect the community. A 29-year-old active Mascot police officer named James Aren Duckett. What could drive a man sworn to enforce the law to commit such a tragic act against a young community member? To understand what led James Duckett to this point, one must look past the blue uniform and understand his path long before he ever joined the force. Examining his background, early adult life, and personal patterns provides crucial context to the events at Lake Knight. James Aren Duckett grew up in the rural landscapes of Central Florida during the 1960s and 1970s. To outward observers, his early life appeared relatively conventional. Raised in a traditional working-class household, Duckett was described by acquaintances as a quiet, rigid individual. From an early age, he exhibited a strong fixation on figures of authority, rule enforcement, and institutional power. He sought respect and status, though behind his polite demeanor lay a troubling desire for control over others. As he reached adulthood, Duckett directed his focus toward a career in law enforcement. He enrolled in a regional criminal justice academy, studied state statutes, mastered police procedures, and earned his certification. Eventually, he secured a position as a patrol officer with the Mascot Police Department in Lake County. To the local population of Mascot, Officer Duckett was a familiar presence. He drove through neighborhood streets in his marked sedan, patrolled local parks, and stopped by convenience stores during his shifts. However, subtle warning signs had begun to emerge in the months leading up to May 1987. Former acquaintances later recalled concerning behavior. Duckett frequently lingered near locations where young residents gathered, using his position to initiate conversations and build unearned trust. His role gave him unfettered access, authority, and the ability to interact with vulnerable individuals without immediate scrutiny. On May 12, 1987, there was no prior history between Officer James Duckett and 11-year-old Teresa McCabe. Teresa was simply an innocent child who held the standard trust that small-town residents place in a uniformed officer. As Teresa walked home from the store, a marked police cruiser pulled up alongside her, along the darkened roadside. Eyewitnesses near a nearby business saw the cruiser idle by the sidewalk. Through the window, Officer Duckett called Teresa over and offered her a ride, indicating he would drop her off safely at her mother's house nearby. Trusting the officer, Teresa opened the door and stepped inside. The moment the door closed and the patrol car pulled away, Duckett departed from standard procedure. Instead of heading toward Teresa's home, Duckett navigated the marked car down secluded back roads, steering toward the darkened shoreline of Lake Knight, a remote location known to local officers. Once parked in complete isolation, Duckett turned against the young passenger. Afraid and desperate to escape, Teresa resisted and attempted to reach for the door handle. Realizing that she could report his actions, an event that would immediately end his career and remove his authority, Duckett escalated his actions to prevent her from speaking out. He removed her from the vehicle and directed her toward the edge of the water. In the shallow, dark water, Duckett used his superior weight and physical strength to submerge Teresa, holding her underwater despite her desperate struggles until her breathing ceased and her body went limp. Leaving her body in the reeds, Duckett casually walked back to his patrol car, wiped down any immediate physical traces, picked up his police radio to report his location to county dispatch, and resumed his nightly patrol duties as if nothing had ever happened. When news of Teresa McCabe's murder broke the following morning, a wave of grief and fury washed over the small community of Mascot. Shockingly, among the initial officers responding to the crime scene at Lake Knight was James Duckett himself. He walked along the perimeter, observed state crime scene technicians, and casually conversed with fellow officers, seamlessly integrating himself into the active investigation while secretly monitoring the evidence being collected. However, the investigation was quickly taken over by special agents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE. Detectives methodically reconstructed Teresa's final steps, interviewing residents who had been near the Circle K store that evening. The first major breakthrough came when two independent witnesses came forward with a crucial detail. They had seen Teresa speaking through the window of a marked Mascot police cruiser right before she vanished. FDLE agents immediately audited the police department's radio logs and dispatch records. The logs revealed two devastating facts. First, Officer James Duckett was the only officer on duty in that sector at that precise time. Second, Duckett had a glaring, unexplained 30-minute gap in his radio communication during the exact window when Teresa went missing. Investigators impounded Duckett's police vehicle for intensive forensic examination. Crime scene technicians discovered critical microscopic evidence. Carpet fibers recovered from Teresa's clothing matched the exact synthetic fibers of the interior flooring in Duckett's patrol car. Furthermore, forensic tire tread analysis of the mud near Lake Knight revealed tire impressions that matched the Goodyear tires mounted on Duckett's cruiser. When brought in for formal interrogation, Duckett offered shifting, contradictory stories. He initially denied seeing Teresa at all, then admitted to briefly chatting with her, but adamantly denied she had ever entered his vehicle. In 1988, James Aren Duckett stood trial in Lake County, charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and attempted sexual battery. The prosecution presented an overwhelming chain of circumstantial and forensic evidence, painting Duckett as a dangerous predator who hid behind a badge to prey upon the innocent. The defense argued that the physical evidence was inconclusive and suggested that an unknown outsider was responsible. The jury saw through the defense's arguments and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. During the penalty phase, the jury recommended death, and the trial judge formally sentenced James Aren Duckett to capital punishment. For the next 38 years, Duckett resided on death row at Union Correctional Institution. Over nearly 4 decades, his defense team launched endless procedural appeals through state and federal courts. They challenged the validity of the fiber evidence, questioned the police department's evidence handling protocols, and repeatedly challenged Florida's lethal injection procedures. Throughout every legal petition, Duckett maintained his absolute innocence, claiming he was framed by political enemies within the department. Yet, after decades of thorough judicial review, every single state and federal appellate court upheld both his conviction and his sentence. On July 28, 2026, the decades-long legal process reached its absolute end at Florida State Prison in Raiford. Prior to his execution, James Aren Duckett requested a final meal in accordance with Florida Department of Corrections guidelines, which caps requested meals at $50 and requires items to be purchased locally. His last meal request, a large pizza topped with extra cheese and Italian sausage, a side order of crispy French fries, a slice of warm pecan pie, a cold 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola. Duckett ate the meal inside his holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber just hours before he was led to the gurney. Shortly before 6 p.m., media witnesses, legal representatives, and members of Teresa Maccabee's surviving family were escorted into the viewing room adjacent to the execution chamber. The heavy curtain was drawn back, revealing Duckett strapped securely to the padded metal gurney with IV lines inserted into his arms. When the warden asked if he wished to make a final statement, Duckett looked toward the glass window and maintained his innocence to his final breath, reiterating that he was not responsible for the death of Teresa Maccabee. In his last words, he said, "I am going to my death an innocent man. I did not kill Teresa Maccabee, and I had no part in what happened to that young girl. I pray that the truth will one day come out and reveal what really happened. God is my witness, and my conscience is clear." At 6:03 p.m., the execution team initiated the 3-drug lethal injection sequence. Within moments, the powerful sedative coursed through his system. His eyes closed, his chest movement slowed, and his body went completely still. At 6:13 p.m., a medical examiner performed the final checks and officially pronounced James Aren Duckett dead at the age of 68. After 39 years of pain, legal battles, and waiting, the execution brought a definitive close to one of Florida's most notorious abuses of authority, Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. On the quiet, humid night of June 10, 1986, in the small coastal community of Hudson in Pasco County, Florida, neighbors were suddenly jolted awake by the frantic, echoing sounds of gunfire ripping through the night air. When emergency responders and deputies rushed to the modest single-family home on Arbutus Drive, they stepped inside to a scene of utter devastation. Lying lifeless inside the residence were 49-year-old Wilbert Gill and his 48-year-old wife, Anita Gill. Both had been brutally shot at point-blank range in their own home. When detectives began reconstructing the terrifying hours leading up to the double homicide, collecting shell casings and interviewing terrified witnesses, every single line of inquiry pointed directly to one man, a 36-year-old local resident named Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. What could drive a man to burst into a quiet suburban home and slaughter an innocent couple in cold blood? To understand what led Dominick Occhicone down this catastrophic path of violence, you have to look past the blood-soaked crime scene and understand who he really was long before that deadly midnight hour. We need to turn back the clock, examining his origins, his upbringing, his personality, and the bitter personal spiral that preceded the killings. Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. was born into an Italian-American family, growing up in a close-knit, working-class neighborhood. To those who knew him during his early years, Occhicone was an energetic, sharp-tongued young man who possessed a charming exterior when things went his way. However, beneath that surface charm burned an intense, highly volatile personality. From his teenage years into young adulthood, Occhicone struggled with emotional regulation, possessive tendencies, and an absolute intolerance for rejection or personal loss. As he entered his 20s and 30s, Occhicone worked various blue-collar jobs in Central and Gulf Coast Florida. He acquired a reputation among acquaintances as someone who held deep, long-lasting grudges. When relationships soured or personal disputes arose, Occhicone did not walk away. He became obsessed, brooding over perceived slights until his frustration evolved into explosive anger. By the mid-1980s, Occhicone entered into a romantic relationship with a young woman named social worker and mother Robin Gill, the daughter of Wilbert and Anita Gill. The relationship between Dominick Occhicone and Robin Gill was volatile from the start. What began as a passionate courtship quickly turned suffocating due to Occhicone's controlling nature. As months passed, his possessiveness intensified into relentless jealousy and emotional hostility. Robin eventually realized that the relationship was unhealthy and dangerous. Exercising her independence, she made the decisive choice to break off the relationship, moving out and seeking refuge with her supportive parents, Wilbert and Anita, while caring for her young son. Occhicone refused to accept the breakup. He viewed Robin's departure not as a personal decision, but as a humiliation orchestrated by her family. In his mind, Wilbert and Anita Gill were the primary obstacles preventing Robin from returning to him. Over several weeks, Occhicone began harassing the family, making cryptic phone calls, cruising past their house in his car, and making subtle, ominous threats that, if he could not have Robin, no one would be happy. Wilbert and Anita Gill did everything they could to shield their daughter and grandchild from Occhicone's escalating threats, standing firm as a wall of protection around their family. That protective stance made them the primary targets of Occhicone's vengeful fixation. On the night of June 10, 1986, Occhicone's brooding resentment boiled over into a murderous rage. Fueled by anger and intent on retribution, he grabbed a loaded firearm, got into his vehicle, and drove directly to the Gill home on Arbutus Drive. Arriving under the cover of darkness around midnight, Occhicone did not knock or attempt to talk. He cut the power or waited in the shadows before violently forcing his way inside the home through a glass door. Inside, Wilbert Gill confronted the intruder in a desperate attempt to protect his family. Without hesitation, Occhicone raised his gun and fired multiple shots, hitting Wilbert and causing him to collapse onto the floor. Hearing the gunfire, Anita Gill rushed into the room to aid her husband. Occhicone turned the weapon on her, shooting her repeatedly at close range before she could escape or call for help. Robin Gill and her young child, who were inside the house during the attack, cowered in absolute terror as bullets shattered the middle of the night silence. Having executed both parents, Occhicone fled the house, stepped back into his car, and sped away into the darkness, leaving a traumatized family in his wake. The double murder of Wilbert and Anita Gill shocked the quiet community of Pasco County. Law enforcement immediately launched a massive, multi-county manhunt. Robin Gill gave investigators a clear, definitive identity of the killer, Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. Detectives blanketed the region, monitoring his known haunts, interviewing associates, and alerting regional police departments. Within hours of the shooting, deputies located Occhicone and took him into custody without further bloodshed. During initial questioning, investigators noted his cold, detached demeanor. Crime scene technicians collected physical evidence linking Occhicone to the scene, including ballistics analysis that matched bullet fragments recovered from the victims to ammunition connected directly to Occhicone. In 1987, Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. stood trial in Pasco County Circuit Court, facing 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution built an ironclad case, presenting Robin Gill's eyewitness account, ballistics evidence, and testimony detailing Occhicone's history of stalker-like behavior and explicit threats against the victims. The defense argued that Occhicone suffered from diminished capacity and extreme emotional distress at the time of the shootings. However, the jury rejected these arguments, finding him guilty on both counts of first-degree premeditated murder. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued several heavy, aggravating factors. The murders were committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner without any moral or legal justification, and Occhicone had created a great risk of death to multiple persons. The jury returned a recommendation for the death penalty on both counts. The presiding judge agreed, formally sentencing Dominick Occhicone to death. Occhicone was transferred to Florida State Prison, where he would spend the next 39 years on Florida's death row. His 4-decade stay in prison became one of the longest in the state's modern history. Over nearly 40 years, his defense attorneys filed wave after wave of state and federal appeals. They challenged jury instructions, raised claims regarding effective assistance of counsel, contested Florida's capital sentencing structure, and repeatedly filed challenges against lethal injection protocols as scientific standards evolved. Throughout all the litigation, appellate courts repeatedly affirmed his conviction and sentence, determining that the overwhelming evidence of premeditated double murder warranted the ultimate punishment under the law. By mid-2026, all legal avenues were finally exhausted. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant, setting Occhicone's execution date for late July 2026. On July 28, 2026, the very same day, fellow death row inmate James Aren Duckett was scheduled for execution. Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. faced his final hour at Florida State Prison in Raiford. In accordance with Florida Department of Corrections protocol, Occhicone was served his final requested meal in his cell prior to being transferred to the execution preparation room. Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. opted for a classic heavy comfort food menu for his final hours on death row. His last meal request, a T-bone steak, seasoned and cooked medium well, a large baked potato loaded with butter and sour cream, a garden salad with ranch dressing, a serving of warm apple pie, a large glass of iced tea. Occhicone consumed his last meal quietly in his cell under standard supervision before preparing for his final walk to the chamber. At 6 p.m., as witnesses sat behind the thick glass window of the execution chamber, the curtain was drawn open. Inside lay 76-year-old Dominick Occhicone, strapped securely to the metal gurney with IV lines inserted into both arms. When asked by the warden if he had any final words to offer before the sentence was carried out, Occhicone made his last statement, addressing those present in his final moments before falling silent. For his last words, he said, "I hope that this brings whatever peace or closure is possible to the family and everyone who was hurt by the events of that night. I take responsibility for my actions, and I ask Almighty God to have mercy on my soul." At the warden's signal, the execution team administered the 3-drug lethal injection protocol. The heavy sedatives took effect quickly. His breathing slowed, his face relaxed, and his body became entirely still as the lethal agents entered his bloodstream. At 6:15 p.m., a medical examiner stepped forward, checked his vital signs, and officially pronounced Dominick Anthony Occhicone Jr. dead at age 76. His execution closed the final chapter on a brutal 1986 double homicide, delivering an ultimate solemn resolution 39 years after Wilbert and Anita Gill lost their lives.